Mr. President, I come to the floor today to express my concern and my disappointment over the decision by the President to formally withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. Though the President announced this decision over 2 years ago, this past Monday marked the first day his administration could send a letter to the United Nations formalizing the year-long withdrawal process. And of course, we know that they did that. American leadership on climate action is being ceded to other countries before our very eyes. With this move, the President is betraying the trust of the American people and betraying the trust of our international allies in the fight against climate change. Climate change is a very real and present threat to our environment, to our national security, to our economy, to our health, and to our very way of life. That's why I introduced the International Climate Accountability Act, to prevent the President from using funds to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement. This bipartisan bill would also require the administration to develop a strategic plan for meeting the commitments we made in Paris in 2015. We can see on this chart that the House passed legislation over 6 months ago, 188 days since the House passed their legislation, the Climate Action Now Act. And yet, in the Senate, the majority leadership has refused to call up this bill for a vote. And the administration's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement and the general refusal to bring climate change legislation to the floor is out of step with the desires of the American people. Approximately 2 out of every 3 Americans believe it's the job of the federal government to combat climate change, according to a recent poll from the Associated Press. The same poll found that 64% of Americans disapprove of the President's climate change policies. Unfortunately, the Senate majority leadership continues to refuse to act on climate change. And yet, what we hear from our scientists and experts tell us that we need to act, and act now, on climate change before it's too late. And this poll shows us, as others have, that a supermajority of the American public wants us to do just that. I've come before this body a number of times in the past to highlight the impact of climate change in my home state of New Hampshire. We see very directly the effects of climate change, and the farther north you go, the more you see those impacts. Our fall foliage season is shortened, our maple syrup production is disrupted, our outdoor recreation industries are hampered, our ski industry, our snowmobiling, our lobsters are moving north to colder waters, our moose population is down 40%, and Lyme disease is on the rise. But today, what I really want to highlight are the revelations that have been made clearer in recent weeks by our national security experts. A report entitled Implications of Climate Change for the U.S. Army that was commissioned by the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, reads, "The Department of Defense is precariously unprepared for the national security implications of climate change-induced global security challenges." The Pentagon's report on the effects of a changing climate to the Department of Defense reads, and we can see it right here, "The effects of a changing climate are a national security issue with potential impacts to Department of Defense missions, operational plans, and installations." And when former Secretary of Defense James Mattis was before the Senate Armed Services Committee for his confirmation hearing in 2017, his testimony read, in part, and I quote, "Climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating today." I had the chance to ask him in that hearing, "Do you believe climate change is a security threat?" And he responded this way. He said, "Climate change can be a driver of instability, and the Department of Defense must pay attention to potential adverse impacts generated by this phenomenon." He went on to say, Climate change is a challenge that requires a broader whole-of-government response. Now, I could go on detailing the calamitous conclusions of our national security experts, but instead I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that a letter from nearly 60 national security and military leaders addressed to the President be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. This letter very directly rebukes the attempt by the President to create a committee within the National Security Council that would undermine military and intelligence judgments on the threats that are posed by climate change. So instead of recognizing those, developing a plan to address them, what the President has been trying to do is to figure out how to undermine those very judgments. So, Mr. President, at this time, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Foreign Relations be discharged from further consideration of S. 1743 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. With all due respect to my good friend and colleague from New Hampshire, we both serve on the Foreign Relations Committee. And the Foreign Relations Committee is, as has been noted, the committee of jurisdiction on this matter. We're talking about the Paris Climate Agreement and what Senator Shaheen is attempting to do with this. And again, with all due respect, I understand where she's coming from on it, is to stop the President from withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement that was made by his predecessor, President Obama. Let me say, first of all, that the senator is right, that the changes that we're experiencing are great. They have large effects. They are of great magnitude. And just as importantly, changes that we make attempting to address this are going to have great magnitude, in a great magnitude. They are going to affect the American people, both financially and in the quality of life and the lifestyle that they enjoy. So we can't do anything about the change as it's occurring right now, but what we can do is do something about the way that we attack this and the way that we make changes to our lifestyle and what we will give up and what people are willing to give up in order to address this. And so the way this is done is nations get together to talk about this. The 200 nations get together. They did, and they came up with a Paris Climate Agreement. Under Article 2 of the United States Constitution, Section 2, the President is given the power to make treaties with other countries. And that's what President Obama attempted to do with this. However, Section 2 goes on to say that the President can make these treaties provided 2/3 of the Senate present concur. So that is a treaty, and that's how ordinarily agreements are made between nations. Obviously, we can do things ourselves without having a 2/3 vote, with 60% vote in the Senate and a simple majority vote in the House. We can do that amongst ourselves if we want to change U.S. law as to how we're going to change the way we do industry and the way we lead our lives. We can do that with that kind of a vote. If we're going to agree with other countries, on the other hand, it takes a 2/3 vote. Now, at the time this was negotiated, I disagreed with President Obama, and I disagree with the accord at this time. And the reason I do is I really believe that this is a bad deal for the people of the United States. I really believe that we can get a better deal. And I think what we need to do, if we're going to do that, is we need to do it on a bipartisan basis. There is not going to be a 2/3 vote without a bipartisan agreement on this issue. So I would like to see this addressed. I would like to see us, as the Foreign Relations Committee, us as the first branch of government, constitutionally protected as such, be a part of this, and not just the second branch negotiating and then entering into the agreement. So the president has, number one, he has every right to withdraw from this agreement, just as President Obama had the right to enter into this executive agreement. And I, for one, agree that he should withdraw from the Paris Accord. In fact, I encouraged him to do so personally when he was running, and then when he was elected, and continuously since then. And that doesn't mean we should walk away from this by any stretch of the imagination. But I think what we should do is do what the United States Constitution envisions, and that is you have a negotiation between us, the United States, and other countries, and then the matter be submitted to the United States Senate for a vote to see if 2/3 of us can agree that this is the way to do this. So based on that, Mr. President, with all due respect to my good friend from New Hampshire, I object.
The objection is heard. Noted. Yeah, Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I'm not surprised by my colleague's objection. I am, however, disappointed. And I have to disagree to some extent with the rationale, because, in fact, this was not a treaty. It was a voluntary, non-binding agreement that the United States entered into voluntarily. And I'm not saying that President Trump doesn't have the authority to withdraw from the agreement. I'm saying he's wrong to withdraw, because it's not in the United States' national interest to withdraw from this agreement. There is an international race to develop clean energy technologies and practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this race exists in large part because of the goals that were established in the Paris Climate Agreement. And instead of leading the pack in this race, which the United States should be doing, the president has chosen to put us on the sidelines. We're gonna watch our allies and our adversaries clamor to fill the void that he's created. And after decades of American leadership in clean energy technology innovations, other countries are now poised to develop new low-carbon technologies to help countries throughout the world meet their Paris commitments. Those could be American technologies. Those could be American jobs. And instead of being developed in the U.S., too many of these new technologies and the jobs that go with them will be developed outside of our shores. This is a missed opportunity for the United States. It's a setback for the American economy and for American workers. The scientists are in agreement worldwide. Climate change is the single greatest environmental, public health, and economic challenges that our world has ever faced. And right now, watching the president withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, sitting idly by, this Congress is surrendering American leadership in the fight against climate change. So I hope that as time goes by, the president and our Republican colleagues will rethink the position and acknowledge the need to do something to address the climate challenge that we're facing, and to make sure that the United States is in line for those jobs and the new energy economy that's being created. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.